trickle in. So thank you so much, Ryan and Mike, for joining us. So for everyone who's here, Mike's the CEO and co-founder of TopHat. So they graduated from the Accelerator program. And Ryan is one of our current AC clients. So he's in the AC Jumpstart program. And he's the CEO and co-founder of Lumined. So it's just some facilitated questions between Mike and Ryan. If you have any questions throughout, feel free to put them in the chat and then I'll keep track of them throughout the event. And then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. We'll save about 20 minutes to half an hour at the end for some Q&A. So Ryan and Mike, you can go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, thanks for having us. And on the first snow event of the year, Mike's up hiding out in Quebec, enjoying the outdoors, and I'm KW. I wanted to, first of all, thanks Mike as well for joining and for sharing your wealth of knowledge. I'm sure you've learned a lot over the years building a crazy Canadian edtech story. So thanks for joining us as well.
For sure. Happy to be here.
I guess, first of all, just for the record, so Mike and I actually worked together back in 2008 in the Accelerator Center when he was the engineer designing circuit boards and software to count traffic, count cars at intersections, and I was the annoying salesperson that was telling the same jokes on repeat over and over that he had to listen to and break his concentration. So we've come a few steps since then, and it's kind of funny to be here full circle having this chat as well. Hopefully you remember those days fondly, Mike.
Yeah, no, those are fun times. That was a good, for me, a good crash course in startups. Yeah, I certainly think it helped me, get going more quickly with TopHat as a result.
I'm curious to dive into sort of, we've broken this up into kind of 3 sections, like back when you were a startup, and then let's talk about where you're at today, and also focus a bit on what the future of edtech is. So back when you were a startup, I mean, I guess maybe more fundamentally, you've raised lots of money, you're a socially driven enterprise. Like, what is the mission for TopHat, and can you tell us a bit about, how that started?
Yeah, and would it help to give people an overview of what TopHat does? I mean, some people may have heard of us, but I thought that might help as well. But I'll start with the mission. I think that's a good starting point. Our mission is to empower educators to help them engage students and unleash their potential. That's kind of what's on our banners and our t-shirts. And at the highest level, what TopHat is trying to do is to create a suite of tools, software, and content for educators, primarily in higher education, to create really engaging course experiences for their students, and ultimately to drive better outcomes. And more concretely, what that means is we replace traditional print textbooks with digital interactive courseware, and we give the professor a bunch of resources and tools to really make every aspect of their interaction with their students more engaging. So their homework, their in-class interaction, their assignments, their exams, every element of that is run through TopHat and is much more engaging, for the students. And we've had a good amount of success, as Ryan mentioned. We've raised a good amount of cash over the years, and we're used by millions of students all across North America at pretty much every large institution in North America, and now starting to grow beyond that as well.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing. And it's come a long way, obviously, from where you started. I guess I'm curious, since our days at Myovision, when ultimately you left the company and went to start TopHat to beginning, like what was the foray into edtech? What brought you here, and how did TopHat actually come to be?
Yeah, I would say, like most good companies get started when, the founder or founding team is solving a problem that they had. And this is particularly true of, young founders that don't have a ton of work experience, because when you start a company around a problem that you have, you address one of the big challenges, which is having domain expertise and really understanding the customer, because in many ways you are the customer. And that's the story with Top Hat. With motivation for starting the company really came out of my experience in undergrad at Waterloo, and having a lot of the same challenges and frustrations that students and other students had and continue to have to this day around courses that are just not particularly engaging or effective at teaching students, at course material that is passive and out of date, and really looking at that and seeing an opportunity to transform that learning process to be much more active and engaging with better outcomes for students all around.
I'm curious, for my own sake, building an ed tech company, it's a busy space. And even back in 2009, when 2009-ish, when you guys would have started, there were 1,000 LMSs on the market and, lots of content providers out there. So how did you make sense of, okay, it's a competitive space to build a company in, but I'm still having this problem in school, therefore I should still build a company and go for it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, on the one hand, honestly, we didn't think about it that much. We just saw a problem and wanted to solve it. We really didn't do much of a market analysis or an assessment of like, hey, is this really a good idea to start a company in this space? And look, if we had, I don't know that we would have started the company in this category, because it's a hard one. And yeah, there. I guess in any industry, there's a lot of people doing a lot of things, but so that's one thing, is like we didn't know enough to know how hard it would be, and so we just kind of went for it. But the other thing I would say is that we were very iterative about it. In other words, when we went into the space and worked on this this idea and started building on it, we really spent a lot of time listening and understanding our customer needs, and just iterating on the idea and our go-to-market until it kind of aligned to something that we felt could really scale. It wasn't like we had this stroke of genius or insight and then just went to it. Like, it was a huge number of mistakes and uncertainty and almost sort of failures all throughout the journey, but with perseverance and being smart about a couple of things, that we were able to get there.
I'm curious, actually. I had wanted to ask you about some of the major points of failure in the journey. It's been just over 10 years. I'm curious, like, of course there are many points of failure, but can you talk a bit about, especially at the startup stage, and then as you started to scale, what were some of the defining points of failure, maybe both personally and for the company, and what you did about those?
Yeah, there were a lot, and it doesn't end, right? Like, you don't reach a certain point where suddenly everything just goes smoothly. I don't know, maybe some people do, but certainly not the case for us. So at every stage, you're having to kind of reinvent the business. Like from the very beginning, even our go-to-market and our who we thought was our customer was not correct. We initially tried to start with institutional enterprise sales at the university, and realized very quickly that was just going to be a dead end, at least for our product category. And so then we had to pivot more towards a courseware type offering, which is sold sort of through the professor and purchased by the students. Our product suite, I wouldn't even get into originally kind of what it focused on, but like eventually we narrowed down to a very specific niche within courseware, from something that was in another category and much broader. So we decided to kind of narrow down and focus on one particular thing, get really good at that, and then build on it over time, which is, that's a pretty standard thing. It's actually a pretty standard strategy, but we didn't know that at the time. We were just kind of figuring it out. Fundraising challenges, like almost every fundraise, not quite every fundraise, was a near-death experience where you think, oh man, I'm not sure how we're going to get this done, and eventually you do. that, there were lots of those types of, making strategic decisions around product direction that didn't end up working out. So tons and tons. I mean, those are some high level examples, but as I said, the main point is that it's kind of an ongoing process of reinvention and innovation.
Yeah, that's great. It really is. I think it's a sage advice to think that to warn startup founders that you're looking for it to be smooth running and to really get there. And I think the journey is about adversity and about overcoming adversity, nonstop. And we're all learning that every day. I think that's well spoken and well said. Thank you for that. I'm curious, just to talk a bit about the fundraise. Obviously lots of early stage startups are seeking fundraise. Obviously the revenue is the best financing, as we like to say, but ultimately when you're going out for fundraising and along the journey, can you just talk about the sequence and maybe which one was the hardest and which one was the simplest and why?
Which round was the hardest and easiest?
And we're all startups here at the early stages, so if you can sort of relate back to the beginning and think through where you're at now.
So I mean, I'll say this, I guess before I say anything else, is that it's really changed. I mean, the environment for fundraising now is very different than it was 10 years ago. From everything I've seen, it seems like it's a lot easier. There's just a lot more capital, there's a lot more investors, there's a lot more maturity about investors that are participating in the Canadian ecosystem. So they know what they're doing more. And there was a lot less of that, way back when. Back then there really almost wasn't a startup ecosystem to speak of, and the valuations were a lot lower, and it was harder, I think, because U.S. investors were participating a lot less in Canada. And in some ways, once you get to the later stages, things do get a lot easier. I mean, it just becomes a lot clearer what you need to do. Sorry, a second. So in the earliest stages, I'll give kind of generic advice or a path to what it might look like. Let's say today, the best way to raise funding is through introductions from other founders who have already raised funding. I mean, that's pretty much really the only way to do it. There's a lot of information these days, out there about how to raise capital. But the naive approach, maybe if you just graduated, you're trying to figure out how to raise money. You start looking up different funds and people that you might be able to talk to. And every one of these funds has like a form on their website where you can submit a business plan or reach out. And it's often been described as sort of a Venus flytrap. Like anybody that submits their business plan or idea through that form automatically does not get funded, because that's just that's not the way that things work. It's still very much old school, in that it works through introductions. Most founders, even at later stages, will generally take a meeting to help a founder out. Like that's at least in my experience, most people are really willing to lend a hand. So my advice on the earlier stage of financing is, one, get yourself to a point where you've got a product, maybe a couple of customers, early beta users. Get yourself to a point where you've done enough work to demonstrate that you've got something real, and that doesn't require financing, or it shouldn't require financing. Right. Like you shouldn't be raising at the sort of idea stage, given how easy or relatively easy it is to just build a prototype and start talking and getting some customers. And then once you're at that stage, you start talking to other founders who have raised money, maybe either in your industry or more generally, and have them introduce you to their investors. And if what you've built is good and has any kind of traction, I mean, it won't be that hard to get those introductions. And that'll basically be your first round of financing. After that, I mean, you sort of network through investors, through yeah, mostly through investors or other founders to get introduced to the next level of financiers, which is typically seed stage or Series A stage funds, which is typically when you've got about $1 million in revenue, give or take, and then kind of go from there. So that's sort of the sequence that we followed, and I think still pretty much holds true today.
Yeah, cool. And so would you say there was one in particular raise that was the most challenging, and why was that? You said they were all near death.
I mean, they were all challenging. Yeah, they were all challenging in one way or another. I mean, our first round was really hard just because there were not a lot of investors in Canada. There was not a lot of information available out there on how to raise financing. So my approach was really, doing things like going to events, talking to angel networks, which I think have kind of mercifully disappeared at this point. I don't know. Hopefully they weren't very good source of financing at that time. So I don't know if they still exist. So anyway, just doing whatever it took. I mean, we probably did like 60 investment pitches before we were able to land our first round of financing, which was like $200,000 Canadian, and I think it was like $1 million valuation. So and this was after we had a product and revenue. So these days I'm seeing people raise at $10 million pre-money with basically a PowerPoint deck, exaggerating a little bit, but very different times.
Yeah, for sure. I guess maybe we'll transition to where you're at today. I'm curious to talk a little bit about, you started in 2009, education, the landscape has changed dramatically, and so has EdTech, both on the product side, on the fundraising side. To your point, I'm curious, walk me through what you perceive has changed in the last 10 years, and let's talk a bit about where it's going.
Yeah, I mean, things have changed, tremendously. Back when we were starting out, I mean, there really wasn't, a mobile ecosystem, obviously, because we were starting when, the smartphones were just starting to come out. Although there were a lot of, relative to today, I wouldn't even say there were a lot of products. Today, it just feels like every version of every possible idea that you can envision has been developed, and it's more of a kind of a consolidation positioning play now. But that being said, I mean, still, I would say there are a lot of interesting opportunities. Yeah, I mean, as I think about it now, the biggest challenge that we had around sort of product and go to market was that, it's almost like a blessing and a curse that there wasn't a lot out there, in that it's good in that I guess you had less competition, but it's bad in that the market wasn't also very well developed. Like, people weren't used to buying and adopting technology, and the idea of using technology in your course in general was kind of alien. Most professors at the time, I mean, they weren't even using PowerPoint in a lot of cases. They were using their overhead transparencies. Laptops in class were still pretty rare. Assignments were all done on paper. Everything was manual. Everything was basically the exact same as it had been for 100 years. And so you can say, well, great, that's very fertile ground, so much opportunity. But on the flip side of it, when you went to potential customers, they were kind of like, they were less ready to buy. Today, the market is a lot more developed. As I said, there's a lot of versions of everything, basically, for every category. But you also have a customer base that is using technology. You've got, I don't know if it's most, but a good percentage of classes are leveraging technology pretty heavily. Universities are leveraging technology for everything from admissions to student engagement management to to CRMs to analytics software for the institution. So just they're much more ready to buy and understand the value of technology. But even that being said, I think there's still a ways to go around that. If you look at the kind of the IT spend of the average university, it's still a tiny fraction of what you see in in corporate. Yeah, so those are off the top of my head, those are some things that I've observed that have changed.
Can you share a bit, dive into tell us about your customer and the constituents that you do serve, like who is the ultimate buyer in your scenario, and I'm also curious a bit of like how that's evolved over time. So you talked in the beginning about selling, enterprise sale, and in fact I remember us talking about that in your early days, trying to figure out how do we sell into the enterprise, and so how has that evolved, and who is the customer today?
Yeah, I would say that one of the things that we did correctly is relatively early on, like after the first, I don't know, 3 to 6 months, we were pretty clear about who our customer was. And for us, that primary customer is the professor. I mean, the educator is the primary customer, in that they're the ones that are making the decision to adopt the platform or not. Even when we do an institutional sale or get students to adopt, it still really like comes down to the professor actually leveraging.
And that's been consistent throughout?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
I mean, after the first 6 months, when we figured that out. And I think that's important to know. I think there's a lot that people talk about in the, startup ecosystem, sort of the conventional wisdom. People talk about, pivoting on your product or pivoting on the market that you serve. But I actually think that there's a missed opportunity there, and that people don't talk as much about really nailing who the buyer and the customer is, and the danger of not having clarity around that and trying to serve too many masters. Whether you're selling into HR or finance or sales or whatever, or institutions in higher ed or K-12. Having real clarity about who that buyer is and not trying to serve 3 different buyers. People talk about sort of the question of focus, and they typically talk about it from the standpoint of having a product that doesn't do too many things. But the underlying cause often of people building products that try to do too many things, or don't have good product market fit, is that there is not that clarity on who the buyer is. In higher education in particular, you really can't have 3. Really you can have more than this, but in the broadest terms, you can have 3 different buyers. You can have a product that's aimed directly at the students, at the professors, or at the administration. And there's different subgroups kind of within that. And depending on who the primary buyer is, you really end up building a completely different business. To illustrate the point, like the best example of a student-facing product would probably be something like Chegg or Course Hero. If you're not familiar with those companies, understandably, one is sort of a note-sharing website where students upload mostly assignment solutions and things like that.
Yep.
That's Course Hero, shared with each other. Chegg, basically has sort of a platform where you can pay to have other people do your homework for you, and sort of ancillary tools around that. It's a very much a B2C type of business. They don't have a sales team, obviously. It's all marketing, direct to consumer type go-to-market approach. The product is very polished because it kind of has to be. It has in-app marketing and upsell and so on. Versus if you're building a learning management system like Desire to Learn or Blackboard or Instructure, where your buyer is the CIO. You're building a completely different type of business, right? You're building an enterprise sales team. Your product is not that polished because it doesn't need to be. You're doing sort of RFP based adoptions with checklists, that people are trying to fill in. It's a completely different universe. And if you don't have clarity on is my customer the student primarily or the administration, and you try to somehow be in between those paths, your business just isn't going to work. The business is just going to die. So for us, we needed to have a lot of clarity that the professor is our buyer, and we have to answer the question: what does the professor really care about? Right? They primarily care about saving time, because a lot of them, teaching is not their primary responsibility, They care about having better student outcomes and then generally engaged students, and so on and so on. So having clarity around that really gave us that degree of focus, I think, that we needed.
And so that's great feedback. I think lots of us struggle with focus, and there are a lot of constituents. I use the word to service, and so I mean, ultimately, the end consumer using your application is the student. So, was there ever a time where you thought, no, it's actually the student, and we need to be consumer focused, or no, if we just do a great job of serving the prof, then the consumer will get what they want?
Look, I mean, we have stakeholders. Certainly, students are a stakeholder, and so is the administration. And so we have features and functionality we develop specifically around serving those stakeholders, but it is still around that core of the professor is the primary decision maker and buyer. So in other words, if we're doing something to serve, let's say, students, it has to be really clear, okay, if we serve the students, here's how it's going to benefit the professor. If that makes sense. Like, it has to really all tie back to that original sort of premise that the professor is the the key decision maker for us.
Cool, that's great. I'm curious. So you were obviously, this is a bit of back to startup land, but you started from the Accelerator Center and went through the AC programming. That's certainly an area of focus for them, and lots of great mentorship. How did that influence some of your decision making, and how did you work through the program?
I mean, from what I remember at the time, most of the benefit that we got from the program was really just being around a lot of other startups and learning from those startups, and sharing ideas and investors, and just like that was the that was the main value. I mean, there was a lot of programming kind of in the periphery, which maybe we use, maybe I honestly don't recall, but I don't know if that was the primary value. I think the primary value was just bringing a lot of really smart people together into the same space, and working closely to on similar stages, similar types of problems. I remember the office space we had was very expensive, and so I don't know if that's changed, but that was I don't know, in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't a ton of money, I guess. And hey, it also encouraged us to get out more quickly, so that was good.
It's a different world out there. I mean, the mentorship is great, and now we have to do all the networking via Slack for the most part, just given that it's 2020 and it's a strange year all around.
That's right.
I'd love to jump into a bit, a bit of the future of where you see Top Hat, and also where you see the industry going. I'm curious, how do we deal with the fact that technology at home is far superior than it is in the classrooms generally, and is technology really the panacea? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
So specifically with respect to education?
With education, that's right.
In talking to our customers, we're hearing a lot of different things. Pretty much everybody, views the current situation as temporary, and they're eager to get back to somewhat of a sense of normalcy. However, similarly, everyone has used this experience to identify areas that could benefit more from technology when things go back to normal. So, for example, office hours, to pick one concrete example, is something that I don't know that's ever going to go back to, like, professors sitting in their offices, at their desk waiting for students to maybe show up. I think remote, Zoom-based or otherwise, office hours is probably going to stay. Everyone is enjoying that. Everyone likes that better, especially for these kinds of one-on-one interactions. They like the flexibility. They like not having to commute. Similarly, large lecture hall experiences, there was some professors that sort of tried to take their 300, 500 student classes and just deliver that via, Zoom. at a prescriptive time, and no one enjoyed that. Everyone is saying, well, this is just ridiculous. There's no reason to do this. It's like going back to sort of appointment television after having had Netflix. It's kind of look, if you're going to deliver a video lecture, just record it and then I watch it whenever whenever it's appropriate or convenient for me.
Yeah.
And that works. It works really well, just as well as, again, schlepping over to campus and sitting in these giant lecture halls. So again, I think there's going to be a migration of a lot of these large lecture hall courses to self-paced, asynchronous, online. And then on the flip side, for small classes, 20, 30 student classes, people want to go back to campus. Like Zoom doesn't work, when you've got, a grid of people, with half of them or more having their video turned off, you're sort of talking into a void. Nobody likes teaching that way. People do want to go back to an in-class environment to be able to have that, live interaction and conversation. So I think that is going to come back, in full force. And students want to be on campus. They don't like the idea of, well, I should say, they're certainly not going to pay the kind of tuition that they're being asked to pay for, Zoom University. And so universities were correct, I guess, in really pushing for, well, I say correct from their business model standpoint, in pushing for students to come back to campus, even if they're not going to class. The on-campus environment has a lot of ancillary benefits that they wanted to achieve. So I guess in summary, where I see education going is a lot of the stuff that didn't make sense being transitioned to more online, asynchronous, and then a lot of the things that students and professors do value from the traditional environment coming back in sort of full force. But I fully expect enrollments to decline. I mean, we saw, I think, a 16% decline in first year enrollments. Overall enrollments went down only about, whatever it was, 3 and 4%, but those were students that were already part of the, they were already in university. But first year enrollments went down a lot more, as I said, 16%. And I see that continuing. I think next year you're going to see a similar decline, maybe more, in first year enrollments. And that's going to change things. Canada is a bit different in that universities are a lot more concentrated. There's like a lot of large regional schools. It's not at all the same as in the US, where you've got thousands of tiny schools with a very much kind of a long tail. A lot of those schools are just going to no longer exist. So you're going to see, I think, the large state schools probably continue to persist. The elite schools continue to persist, and then small liberal arts colleges and small regional public schools just getting decimated, probably not existing much longer.
Do you think, like, are schools adopting technology fast enough to serve the constituents? Do you think they're going fast enough, or they're just not thinking about it properly?
No, they're not. They're not. Yeah, you have some schools, in particular some of the more established universities, that still have their head in the sand. They had a really poor experience in the fall. They're going to have another poor experience in the winter, this coming semester, and they're going to see their enrollments really decline. Yeah, so the short answer is no. I think schools are not moving fast enough, and they're going to see their revenue take a big hit, and we're going to see Canadian institutions suffer from that as well. Yeah, like I think a lot of schools got addicted is the right word, addicted to like very high revenue international student revenue, to high international student dollars, and that's clearly going to take a hit, a negative impact. Yeah, so I just think there's going to be challenges all around.
It may be great for the trade schools. We've been suffering from low enrollment to trade schools, and people that use their hands. And so maybe this will shift the pendulum back from academic learning.
For sure, I think a lot of like short degree online programs or live programs are gonna benefit from this. People are going to look at that. Again, it's especially true in the US, that $200,000 liberal arts degree, and say, I could spend $15,000 and go to a coding boot camp and get a 6-figure a year job I think I'll do that.
Yeah.
So, or not go to university at all and go straight into the workforce. So I do think the pendulum is going to shift. And I think that's for the better. I do think we were in a situation where, you know, everybody had to
Overweighted on
get a university
academics.
degree, and
Yeah.
and it was just not true. Like that, I don't know if that was ever the right model. So, so I think we're going to see a sort of correction.
Final question before we go to Q&A, Mike, just, you know, 2020 is a weird year, and we've obviously experienced something globally that we've never been through before. What advice do you have for startups right now in the current climate and where we're at? You know, knowing where you've come from, but also where we're at.
Just kind of general advice.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, there's so many different topics. Like there's the most interesting companies get founded during sort of these discontinuities, right? That occur. You know, in some ways, that was a product of the Great Recession. You know, there were a lot of interesting companies that were founded during the dot-com bubble, you know, 20 years ago now, including companies like Google. I mean, RIM was another example. And hey, RIM was a casualty of the last, the last recession and the transformation that occurred around the same time, you know, with the iPhone. So these discontinuities are great opportunities to start companies. So I would say now is a great time to start a company. And as always, you know, taking a bit of a contrarian view is generally good. I mean, that's sort of Peter Thiel's mantra is like, what's something that you believe that most people disagree with? That's a really good question to be asking. So everyone is saying, you know, it's all going to go work from home. I wonder if there's almost an opportunity to sort of say, well, but what benefit would companies that are still co-located receive? I don't know if that's a good idea, but an example of that kind of thinking. So just thinking about it from that standpoint is probably the right approach. I do think that we are still in the very nascent stage of work from home software, hardware tooling. You know, what we're seeing today, you know, with, I guess, Slack and Zoom, these were tools that were built sort of for the old world. When work from home was sort of the exception rather than the rule. I think we're going to, like, there's a massive, you know, multi-billion-dollar market opportunity around like work from home tooling that is actually appropriate in the in the modern context. And obviously, you know, if you look at the Y Combinator class, you know, this year everyone's working on work from home stuff. So it's like that's not any kind of insightful thing. Like everybody's having the same realization. But the point is that there will be a lot of winners in this space, and there's going to be a lot of transition and change and a lot of opportunity around that. So that's, you know, these are all really interesting and exciting opportunities. You know, taking advantage of lower cost geographies to operate in is another interesting trend. But that being said, look, it's again, you can kind of look at any of these things as you know, one way or the other. But with lower cost geographies, for example, you know, it was never really about the geography. It was really about talent density. And what does that mean in a primarily remote environment? Like, how do you develop that kind of talent density? Like the reason New York and San Francisco and these other ecosystems develop really strong startups is because that's where all the talent was. It wasn't that like magically there's something special about those geographies. And all the good talent kind of flock to those regions. So is that talent going to continue to flock? And then how do you concentrate that talent is going to be a big question for people looking to build you know, big meaningful companies.
Well, you're obviously prototyping that while you're up in northern Quebec running your company from there. So it's a seal of approval. Thank you, Mike. This was really a great conversation, and I'm sure we could talk for hours and days on these topics. So appreciate your time, and we've got a bunch of questions in the Q&A that have come in as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ryan and Mike. That was really good to listen to. So we have a few questions in the chat already. We'll go through these, and if anyone else has any questions, you can either unmute yourself and ask, or you can throw them in the chat if you want me to ask for you. But Katie from Bubble had a couple good questions. So her first one was just wondering if you can pinpoint any of the excellent decisions you made early on as a startup that helped you keep going.
And I saw that come in contrast to, I said, what were all the major points of failure? And Katie said, what were all the major points of brilliance?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really broad question. I mean, I guess I'll answer it this way, and there's lots of ways to answer that question. You know, most of the really good or really bad decisions that we made, and most companies make, are really hiring decisions. You know, when you think about, and this is sort of the Amazon mantra, is that dividing decisions into kind of two classes, sort of easily reversible or not easily reversible, sort of permanent decisions. And the decisions that are easily reversible are ones that you just kind of make the decision and move on quickly and then iterate. Versus the ones that are not easily reversible, you should really like carefully study those decisions and make sure they're the right ones. Well, most decisions around like product direction or a lot of strategy decisions, even market decisions, are fairly easily reversible, right? If you go down a certain path, like you can almost like switch on a dime and change direction. So the most consequential and not as easily reversible decisions are people decisions, in that you bring in folks that they're going to be with you for years and make tens of thousands of decisions and have a huge impact on the business. So really, those are the decisions that actually will drive the business. If you're in the wrong product, in the wrong market, or have a bad product, like, but you have the right people, you'll be able to fix that fairly quickly. Whereas if you happen to be in the right market and have a product that has is really aligned to a need in that market, but you've got the wrong people, I mean, you still won't be able to execute and take advantage of that. So so really, those people decisions are most consequential, which is to say, like, who you hire, who you fire, those decisions that make all the difference. And just getting very methodical and careful about hiring and nurturing talent in the business has been, I would say, the most consequential.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And her next question was asking, when and how did you move into the US market?
We did that relatively early on. Yeah, for us, I would say there's not a huge difference between Canada and the US, aside from the US dollar just being worth more. So yeah, we kind of, aside from sales territories, there's not a lot of difference in terms of how we approach Canada versus the US. That's not true for other industries and other startups. In other categories, you really don't want to treat Canada as just another sort of state in the US, but in our case, you mostly can. And so, as I said, we went into the US relatively early on, in our first like year or two. And it's by far a larger market, and with, as I said, the US dollar, it's also more lucrative to sell into the US. So that's worked well for us.
Perfect. There's another question in here. I think you kind of touched on it during your time talking with Ryan, but someone was just wondering if you ever tried selling direct to students as a B2C education provider.
No, we haven't. I mean, we've thought about it. We've thought about a lot of different ideas. That just takes us in a direction that is very very different than the path that we're on now. At a certain scale, it probably starts making sense for us to do that, just as we're trying to expand our addressable market.
Mike, we're losing?
Yeah. Mike, do you want to just try turning your video off to see if that helps, so we can still hear your audio? You're just frozen.
All right, we seem to have lost Mike for a moment.
Hey, can you hear me now?
Yeah,
There
now we
go.
can hear you.
All right. Yeah, I switched internet here. Let's see if this works.
There we go. Yes, we
We'll
just
maybe repeat that question because we didn't get any of the response from him.
yeah, so we kind of lost you where you talked about at a certain point in scaling, it might make sense to sell direct to students, and then we lost you after that.
Yeah, sorry. So that was pretty much the answer. And all I was saying was that we're currently going after a pretty large addressable market. You know, it's 10 billion in North America, 35 billion worldwide. So there's a lot of room for us to grow without having to, you know, expand kind of to nearby verticals.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Is there anyone else who has, oh, we have one more here. So this is a good question from Katie again. So she has a question around the COVID market. Have you noticed any changes in the types of content that your customers want specifically in 2020 this year?
The types of content, I guess depends what you mean by that question, but I think the answer is no. I mean, there's certainly been much more of an acceptance and embrace, I guess, of digital content, generally speaking. Yeah, I would say certainly much more. So it's the same content, but people are looking for it to be interactive and engaging, which is, you know, Top Hat's sweet spot, and that's an area that we've benefited from as a result. Yeah, I mean, we saw our business definitely expand there from people that previously were sort of saying, you know, you'll pry my print textbook out of my cold dead hands. Now they were saying, okay, well, now maybe we should think about digital now that everything is remote.
Yeah, for sure.
We've had similar feedback, actually, you know, in the tutoring space. Lots of companies have said, yeah, virtual, maybe when I get around to it. Now they said, wow, this is really convenient.
Definitely comes in handy. Another question that we have in the chat is someone wondering if it's common for professors' recommendation to use Top Hat to be rejected by their school administrator?
It's generally a professor decision.
Okay.
So the answer is that it's not common, but it has happened. I mean, there definitely have been schools that, you know, for one reason or another, will say, no, this is not something that we want to support. But it's very rare. I mean, that's not something that happens often.
Perfect. Does anyone else in the group have any other questions?
I'm curious, Mike,
Go ahead, Ryan.
just on a personal level, you know, how do you manage your, you know, especially early stage startup, when we talked about focus, how did you manage, you know, one, your own motivation and excitement and channel that in the right way, but also on behalf of the company, how did you get to focus? And, you know, there's so many opportunities to distract yourself. You know, what sort of tools and techniques do you use to, on a personal level, get to focus and highly productive?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and I don't know that I've got a great answer. I mean, I think we frankly, we made a lot of mistakes. We did do a lot of stuff that we shouldn't have done, just because, you know, I guess me, you know, I didn't know any better. So I don't know that we've had like some, you know, panacea sort of, you know, perfect solution to it. But, you know, I would say the thing that has helped us is just being more clear early on who that primary customer is and what problem we're trying to solve for them. Like that clarity and, like, you know, enshrining that in sort of a mission statement and clarity within the business, like that helped keep some of the distractions away. But like, I wouldn't say that we, you know, we fully got there. Like it's, you know, it's that, I guess, probably nobody, nobody has that, you know, that answer.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again, Mike. Hopefully our circles and paths cross again at some point in the future. And certainly congratulations on all your successes to date. And, continue on, be a shining star for the rest of us in EdTech.
Sounds good. Well, thanks for the invite. Really appreciate it, and I enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mike. And thank you so much, Ryan, for facilitating questions. That was really, really informative and really helpful for our startups. So really appreciate it.